Black man blocked from boarding. When his identity was revealed, the entire airport was shocked. Imagine a doctor, ready to save a life, being stopped at the airport. Shocking, right? But it happened, and what follows will forever change the way you see the world. But before we begin, if you enjoy stories like this, make sure to subscribe to our channel, hit the notification bell, and leave a like to support our work.
The alarm went off at 5 a.m., and I jumped out of bed with a start. My heart was already racing before I even realized what was happening. It was the day of the emergency surgery in another state, and missing this flight was not an option. As I hurried to get ready, my mind drifted to the patient waiting for me. A 62-year-old man with a rare heart condition that few surgeons in the country had experience treating. I knew every minute counted. I looked in the mirror and saw a 45-year-old black man with graying temples and tired eyes from sleepless nights. I threw on a pair of jeans and a simple t-shirt. There was no time to worry about appearances today. "Marcus, you're going to be late," I shouted to myself, grabbing my packed bag and rushing to the car. Traffic was surprisingly light for a Wednesday morning. As I drove, I got a call from Dr. Peterson, my colleague at the hospital where I was headed. "Marcus, glad you picked up. We're all anxious for your arrival. Mr. Thompson is stable, but I understand, James. I'm on my way to the airport now. I'll be there on time. Don't worry," I replied, trying to sound more confident than I felt. I arrived at the airport parking lot with only 40 minutes until boarding. I sprinted through the corridors, dragging my suitcase and bumping into a few distracted passengers. "Excuse me, sorry," I kept repeating as I zigzagged through the crowd. Finally, I reached the check-in counter, out of breath and sweating. The attendant, a middle-aged blonde woman, looked me up and down with a slightly uncomfortable expression. "Good morning. Can I help you?" she asked, her tone not quite matching her polite words. "Good morning. Dr. Marcus Johnson, Flight 302 to Chicago, please. First-class ticket." She typed in some information on her computer, frowning. "Sir, are you sure it's first class?" Confused, I replied, "Yes, absolutely. It's a work trip. The hospital always books first class for medical emergencies." The attendant exchanged a glance with her colleague next to her, who approached. He was a man around 30, with neatly combed brown hair. "Is there a problem, Karen?" he asked. "John, can you take a look at this? The gentleman here claims to have a first-class ticket, but..." John looked at me, then at the computer screen. "Sir, I'm going to need to see your ID, please." Not understanding the reason for the suspicion, but eager to resolve the situation quickly, I handed over my driver's license and hospital ID. John examined the documents for what felt like an eternity. I could feel the sweat trickling down my back, not just from the heat, but from the growing anxiety. "These IDs seem unusual," John commented, looking back at Karen. "Look," I said, trying to stay calm. "I'm a cardiac surgeon. I'm on my way to Chicago for an emergency surgery. If you could please expedite this process, I would greatly appreciate it." Karen and John exchanged skeptical looks. Karen cleared her throat and said, "Sir, I'm going to need you to wait for a moment. I'll call my supervisor." My stomach dropped. The clock on the wall showed only 25 minutes left until boarding. Every second was precious. "Please," I pleaded. "There's no need for that. I can show you my emails, call the hospital, whatever it takes, but I need to get on this flight." At that moment, I noticed some passengers in line behind me starting to get impatient. Some were whispering to each other, while others pulled out their phones, likely to record the scene. A man in a suit, right behind me, spoke loudly. "What's the holdup? Why is this taking so long?" John, visibly uncomfortable with the situation, replied, "Sir, please wait your turn. We're dealing with an identification issue." I felt my face heat up. It was clear what was happening, but I didn't want to believe it. Not in 2023, not to me, not when a life was on the line. "Listen," I said, trying to keep my voice low and controlled. I know I might not look like what you expect from a first-class passenger or a doctor, but I assure you, I am exactly who I say I am. Please check again. Call the hospital if you need to. But I cannot miss this flight." Karen, looking more irritated than sympathetic, responded, "Sir, I'm going to ask you to calm down. Our supervisor is on the way and we'll sort this out. But if you continue to cause a disturbance, we'll have to call security." I closed my eyes for a moment, feeling a mix of anger and despair. How could I explain the urgency of the situation? How could I make them see beyond their prejudices? The supervisor arrived, a middle-aged man with a badge that read Robert. He quickly listened to Karen and John's account, then turned to me. "Dr. Johnson, is it? Could you please come with me? We'll resolve this in a more private setting." As I followed Robert, I heard murmurs from the line behind me. Some seemed sympathetic, others clearly irritated by the delay I was causing. Little did they know that every minute lost here could cost a life in Chicago. Robert led me to a small room at the back of the check-in area. The space was cramped, with just a table and 2 chairs. The white, lifeless walls only added to my sense of claustrophobia. "Dr. Johnson, please have a seat," Robert said, gesturing to one of the chairs. His tone was polite, but I could sense the distrust in his eyes. "Look, Mr. Robert, I really need to catch this flight. There's a patient waiting for me in Chicago for an emergency surgery," I explained, trying to stay calm. Robert looked me up and down, his eyes lingering on my casual clothes. "I understand your urgency, sir, but we have protocols to follow. Could you show me your documents again?" I sighed deeply, but handed over my hospital ID and driver's license once more. Robert scrutinized them, holding them up to the light as if looking for signs of forgery. "These documents seem unusual," he commented, echoing John's earlier words. "They are perfectly legitimate," I responded, frustration growing in my voice. "I can call the hospital right now if you need to confirm my identity." Robert ignored my offer. "Dr. Johnson, if that's really your name, understand that we have to be careful. It's not common to see someone with your appearance claiming a first-class ticket and asserting they're a renowned doctor." I felt my blood boil. "My appearance? What exactly do you mean by that, Mr. Robert?" He looked uncomfortable for a moment, but continued, "Well, your casual attire, your agitated behavior. It's not the typical profile of our first-class passengers." "I'm dressed like this because I left home in a rush for a medical emergency," I exclaimed, my voice rising involuntarily. "And as for my agitated behavior, how do you expect me to act when I'm being stopped from doing my job because of prejudice?" Robert raised his hands in a defensive gesture. "Sir, there's no need to get worked up. We're just following standard procedures." At that moment, I heard a commotion outside the room. The door suddenly swung open, and Karen, the check-in attendant, rushed in. "Robert, the situation is getting complicated out there. Some passengers are filming and saying they're going to post it on social media." Robert's face went pale. He turned to me, his expression a mix of concern and irritation. "Dr. Johnson, I'm going to have to ask you to come with me. We need to resolve this in the presence of our security team." My heart sank. Security? This is ridiculous. I'm the one being discriminated against here. Ignoring my protests, Robert led me out of the room. In the terminal, a small crowd had gathered. Several passengers were pointing their phones in our direction, while others were loudly arguing with the airport staff. A middle-aged woman approached us, her face red with indignation. "This is outrageous. You can't treat people like this just because of the color of their skin." "Ma'am, please step back. This is an internal matter," Robert tried to argue, but his voice wavered slightly. I glanced at the clock on the wall. There were only 10 minutes left until boarding. Desperation began to take hold of me. "Please," I begged, addressing not just Robert but everyone around. "I'm Dr. Marcus Johnson. I have an emergency surgery to perform in Chicago. A life depends on me. I can't miss this. Flight! My plea seemed to resonate with some of the onlookers. Murmurs of sympathy began to spread through the crowd. At that moment, 2 burly security guards approached. "What's the issue here?" asked the taller one, his deep voice echoing through the now silent terminal. Robert started to explain the situation, but was interrupted by a female voice coming from behind the crowd. "Wait a minute. I know this man." The crowd parted, revealing a young woman dressed in a nurse's uniform. She quickly approached, her eyes wide with recognition. "Dr. Johnson? Marcus Johnson?" she asked, stopping in front of me. I blinked, confused for a moment, before recognizing her. "Nurse Thompson? From the conference in Atlanta last month?" She smiled, relieved. "Yes, exactly. I can't believe I'm seeing you here. Everyone, this man is exactly who he says he is. He's one of the most respected cardiac surgeons in the country." A murmur of astonishment rippled through the crowd. Robert and the security guards exchanged nervous glances. Nurse Thompson turned to the airport staff, her voice filled with indignation. "Do you have any idea what you're doing? Dr. Johnson has saved countless lives. He gave an incredible lecture at our conference on innovative techniques in cardiac surgery." Robert's face flushed with embarrassment. He turned to me, stammering, "Dr. Johnson, there's been a terrible misunderstanding." I barely heard his apologies. My eyes were fixed on the clock. 5 minutes until boarding. "I need to board. Now," I said firmly, my voice leaving no room for argument. The panic was palpable in the air. Robert, the supervisor, started sweating profusely, his face shifting from red to white in a matter of seconds. He turned to Karen, the attendant, shouting, "Print Dr. Johnson's boarding pass now." Karen rushed back to the counter, her fingers flying over the keyboard. The crowd around us continued filming, some applauding, others still murmuring in shock. Nurse Thompson held onto my arm. "Dr. Johnson, I'm so sorry about this. It's unbelievable that things like this still happen." I nodded briefly, my mind focused solely on getting to the plane in time. "Thank you for stepping in, Nurse Thompson. You might have saved a life today." Robert returned with my boarding pass in hand, practically pushing me toward the security checkpoint. "This way, Dr. Johnson. We'll take you directly to the gate." We ran through the airport corridors, Robert shouting for people to move aside. We passed through security in record time, the agents clearly briefed on the emergency situation. We arrived at the gate with just 2 minutes left before the doors closed. The flight attendant saw us approaching and frowned. "Sorry, sir, but we're about to..." "Close boarding," she said, her hand already on the door control. Robert intervened, panting. "Please, this is Dr. Johnson. There was a terrible misunderstanding. He needs to be on this flight." The flight attendant looked at me, then at Robert, clearly confused by the situation. I'm not sure if I can..." At that moment, my phone rang. It was Dr. Peterson from Chicago. I quickly answered, putting it on speaker. "Marcus, where are you? The patient is being prepped for surgery." Peterson's anxious voice echoed through the gate area. "I'm at the gate now, James. There was an issue, but I'm resolving it," I replied, looking directly into the flight attendant's eyes. Her expression changed instantly. She nodded and opened the door. "Go ahead, Dr. Johnson. Good luck with the surgery." I ran down the jet bridge, my heart pounding in my chest. As I boarded the plane, I was met with curious looks from the other first-class passengers, probably wondering about the delay. I barely had time to settle in before the plane began to taxi. I closed my eyes, trying to calm my breathing and focus on the task ahead. The 2-hour flight to Chicago felt like an eternity. My mind kept replaying the events at the airport, the anger and frustration mixing with the relief of having made the flight. As soon as the plane landed, I called Dr. Peterson again. "James, I just landed. I'm on my, way." "Thank God, Marcus. Mr. Thompson is stable, but we need to start the surgery as soon as possible." "What happened?" I sighed deeply. It's a long story, James. I'll explain when I get there. A hospital car was waiting for me at the airport. During the ride, I couldn't help but think about how my appearance had almost cost a patient's life. The injustice of the situation consumed me, but I knew I had to focus on the surgery ahead. I arrived at the hospital in record time. The medical team was already prepped, waiting for me in the operating room. As I prepared, Dr. Peterson briefed me on the patient's condition. "Marcus, I'm so glad you're here," he said, the relief evident in his voice. "Mr. Thompson had a minor complication an hour ago, but we managed to stabilize him. We're ready to start as soon as you give the word." I took a deep breath, letting go of all the tension and frustration from the day. Now, my focus was singular: to save the life in my hands. "Let's begin," I said, stepping into the operating room. The next 6 hours were intense. Mr. Thompson's condition was even more delicate than we had initially anticipated. There were moments when I thought we might lose him, but the team worked in perfect harmony. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we successfully completed the surgery. Mr. Thompson's heart was beating strong and steady. I left the EE operating room exhausted but relieved. Dr. Peterson was waiting for me outside, a tired smile on his face. "You did it, Marcus. It was close, but you saved him." I nodded, feeling the weight of the day finally settle on my shoulders. "It was too close, James. Far too close." Peterson frowned, noticing my tone. "What happened at the airport, Marcus? You seem shaken, and it's not just because of the surgery." I looked at my colleague, hesitant. How could I explain what had happened? How could I make him understand the humiliation and anger I had felt? "James, I began, but was interrupted by the sound of my phone. It was a social media notification. My heart sank as I saw the content. It was a video of the incident at the airport, already with thousands of views and shares. The caption read, "Black doctor prevented from boarding emergency flight. Airport racism exposed." My hand trembled as I showed the video to James. His eyes widened in shock and outrage as he watched the scenes unfold on the small screen. "My God, Marcus," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "This is unbelievable. How did you manage to stay calm enough to perform the surgery after that?" I let out a tired sigh. I had no choice, James. Mr. Thompson's life was at stake. At that moment, a nurse appeared in the hallway, her face a mix of concern and excitement. "Dr. Johnson, Dr. Peterson, you need to see this. It's all over the news." We followed the nurse to the waiting room, where a small group of hospital staff was gathered in front of the television. On the screen, a news anchor spoke with seriousness. "Shocking footage of an incident at the international airport this afternoon is circulating on social media. The video shows renowned cardiac surgeon Dr. Marcus Johnson being prevented from boarding an emergency flight due to what appears to be a case of racial discrimination." I felt my stomach churn as the images from the airport played out on the screen. The outraged crowd, Robert trying to explain, Nurse Thompson coming to my defense. It was all there, laid bare for the world to see. "Dr. Johnson was on his way to perform an emergency surgery in Chicago," the anchor continued. "Sources confirm that he arrived in time to save the patient's life, despite the delay caused by the incident." James placed a hand on my shoulder. "Marcus, this is serious. You need to make a statement." I shook my head, feeling suddenly exhausted. "Not now, James. I need to check on Mr. Thompson's recovery." But before we could leave the room, my phone rang again. It was the hospital director, Dr. Laura Chen. "Marcus," she said, her voice a mix of concern and determination. "I just saw the news. We need to talk about how to handle this. The press is asking for a statement." I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of the situation. "Laura, I just came out of a 6-hour surgery. I'm not in the right state to talk to the press right now." "I understand, Marcus," she replied, her voice softening. "But we can't ignore this. It's an opportunity to address a serious issue and make real changes." I took a deep breath, knowing she was right. "Okay, Laura. Give me an hour to check on my patient and pull myself together. After that, I'll do the press conference." After hanging up, I went straight to the ICU to check on Mr. Thompson. He was awake, his eyes slowly opening as I entered the room. "Dr. Johnson," he murmured, his voice weak but full of gratitude. I heard the nurses talking. "Is it true what happened at the airport?" I hesitated for a moment but decided to be honest. "Yes, Mr. Thompson. There was a misunderstanding. But the important thing is that we got here in time." He reached out a trembling hand holding mine. "Thank you, doctor. Not just for saving my life, but for going through all that to get here." I felt a wave of emotion hit me. "It's my job, Mr. Thompson. Rest now. You have a long recovery ahead." I left the room with a renewed sense of purpose. I found James waiting for me in the hallway. "Ready?" he asked. I nodded. "Let's do this." The conference room was packed with journalists and cameras when I entered. Flashbulbs popped, and a murmur of voices filled the air. Dr. Chen stood by my side, offering silent support. I took a deep breath and approached the microphone. The room fell silent. "Good evening, everyone," I began, my voice steady despite my exhaustion. "My name is Dr. Marcus Johnson. Today I faced a situation that no professional, no human being should ever have to face. I was judged not by my skills or my character, but by the color of my skin." I paused, letting my words sink in. "But today, I'm not here to talk about myself. I'm here to talk about Mr. Thompson, the man whose life was saved today because we were able to overcome this obstacle. I'm here to talk about every patient who could have been harmed if this kind of discrimination went unchallenged." Cameras clicked furiously, journalists hanging on every word. What happened today at the airport is not an isolated incident. It's a symptom of a larger problem in our society. But it's also an opportunity to learn, to change, to do better. I looked directly into the cameras, feeling the weight of the moment. From today on, I will work not only to save lives in the operating room, but also to combat prejudice and discrimination at every level of society, because every life matters, regardless of the color of their skin. As the questions began to pour in, I felt a mixture of exhaustion and determination. I knew the road ahead would be difficult, but I was ready to face it, because some battles are worth fighting, no matter the cost.
Dear listeners, how many times in our own lives have we faced unfair judgments or witnessed others being discriminated against? How do we react? Dr. Johnson's actions inspire us to confront injustice with dignity and to use our experiences to drive positive change. This channel is dedicated to bringing you stories like this, stories that not only entertain, but also make us think and grow as human beings. And if you connected with this story, don't keep it to yourself. Share your thoughts in the comments. What would you do in the place of the characters? How would you handle the challenges they faced? Your perspective might be exactly what someone needs to hear today. Until next time.